Hello, everyone out there in radio land. It is once again that time of the week. So our next one, this is about the Biden administration, and it's highlighting some very unfortunate developments. And I wanted to read this story in particular because we're seeing a lot of stuff coming out. You know, there's the situation at the border is continuing to be inhumane. There are still kids in cages. There is now discussion about the Biden administration resuming construction of sections of the border wall, which I I feel like if you have like a socialist or communist or anarchist friend, if you're talking to them around the election, yeah, your cynical buddies, yeah, we're not psychic. We know how this stuff plays out. It's well, what was it? It's like the kids will still be in cages, but the liberals won't talk about it as much. And that's basically what it was. Although honestly, I was a little bit. I thought at least they closed down the camps, but I was being a little a little naive. Now I'm going to read this article, and then I still want to span out and talk about deep dive a little bit more into some of the history behind this stuff. Because when it comes to immigration, this has been a long bipartisan project to dehumanize and bring about institutional cruelty on people seeking refuge. But I'm going to go ahead and read this article. It's from Truth Out. Biden's policies won't address the roots of the migrant crisis. They'll fuel it. It's written by Guillermo Arias. It's published on April 7th. Migrant justice activists are sounding the alarm bell over President Joe Biden's handling of the arrival of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers at the U.S. southern border, and are calling on Biden to follow through on his commitment to address the root causes of migration. What we have here is people fleeing from conditions that they can no longer stand. This is a humanitarian issue. Roxana Bendezu, executive director and founder of Migrant Roots Media, told Truth Out. Far from treating the border crisis as a humanitarian issue, the Biden administration has continued to expel the vast majority of adult migrants through the use of the Trump-era Title 42 emergency declaration concerning COVID-19, which closed the border to non-essential travel under the pretext of limiting the spread of the coronavirus. And by the way, this is something that Biden criticized Trump about as far back as like the fall debates. So, yeah. Anyway, some asylum seekers have even been whisked away in the middle of the night without a hearing, leading activists to compare Biden's treatment of asylum seekers to Trump's. Biden himself has even publicly boasted about the number of migrants his government is expelling. Like Trump, the Biden administration has also continued to apply diplomatic pressure on Mexico and Guatemala to use its security forces to contain the movement of migrants. This is really startling, like it's a new boss, same as the old boss type stuff. Anyway. A lack of planning and infrastructure means the U.S. has struggled to house newly arrived unaccompanied children who are exempted from Title 42. Images of children packed in processing centers and families sleeping under bridges play across people's screens on the evening news, providing fodder to anti-migrant politicians who accuse Biden of provoking the crisis. The situation has become so dire that children in immigration custody have been taken to a military base in El Paso that could be highly contaminated and potentially hazardous, according to a statement from Earth Justice. Following demands by migrant justice activists, the Biden administration seemed poised to differentiate itself from Trump by addressing the root causes of migration. However, migrant justice activists say the government's strategy will have little impact due to the emphasis on methods that have previously failed the people of Central America. Bendezu said Biden's $4 billion strategy for Central America is a continuation of policies that, instead of addressing the root causes of migration, represent an effort to perpetuate a model of economic development that is responsible for the exodus of people from the region to the U.S. In long story short, more neoliberalism. And it's going to talk a little bit about that in deeper depth here. In its analysis of Biden's proposals for Central America, Migrant Roots Media concluded that much like 2014's Alliance for Prosperity, Biden's new plan is largely centered on increasing private investment in Guatemala and Honduras. In a report for Tom Dispatch, historian Aviva Chomsky also concluded that the Biden administration's proposal for Central America differed little from previous plans and would promote a model that Washington has imposed on the countries of Central America over the past century, one that's left its lands corrupt, violent, and impoverished, and so continue to uproot Central Americans and send them fleeing towards the United States. Roberto Lovato, a Salvadoran American writer and political analyst, said that if the U.S. is interested in tackling the root causes of the crisis, U.S. politicians need to take a look at their own policies in the region. If you're going to talk about the root causes of the crisis in Central America, you'd have to start off with U.S. economic policies of expropriation of resources and the exploitation of labor, neoliberal economic policies that create mega projects that destroy the environment and displace hundreds of thousands of people. Lovato said the U.S. policy in Central America has never been driven by a concern for the welfare of people from the region, but instead by the desire of U.S. politicians from both parties to protect U.S. interests in the region. There is a crisis in Central America, but it is not a new crisis. It's not the crisis you see on television. It's the crisis you see in history, said Lovato. And the history of U.S. policy is one of catastrophes created by U.S. economic policies that enrich the minority and impoverish the majority. Rather than abandon these failed economic policies, the Biden administration has instead opted to double down on efforts to dissuade people from attempting the journey, with the Department of State having placed more than 28,000 radio ads on stations throughout Central America and Brazil. Mendezo said he considers it dehumanizing and disrespectful to think that radio ads are going to stop people from fleeing an untenable situation in their countries of origin. Figures reviewed by Reuters show that March U.S. Authorities caught more than 171,000 migrants at the U.S. border with Mexico, representing the highest monthly total in 2 decades. It's not that they don't know the risks that they're taking, but the desperation is so huge that they see no other option, said Bendezu. In response to criticism of the handling of the immigration issue, President Biden tasked Vice President Kamala Harris as his point person on immigration and the border, and also tapped Ricardo Zuniga as his special envoy for Central America. Comments by officials suggest that neither is expected to deviate from Biden's existing strategy. Lovato says Biden's selection of Roberto Zuniga as envoy is particularly telling. Instead of sending someone with experience doing humanitarian work to deal with humanitarian crisis in Central America, you send someone whose specialty is keeping U.S. economic and military policies in place, said Lovato, pointing to Zuniga's role on President Obama's National Security Council. Zuniga is Honduran-born and comes from a long line of supporters of the National Party in Honduras, which has ruled the country since the 2009 coup against President Manuel Zelaya, which is consolidated thanks to the intervention of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Former National Party Congressman Tony Hernandez, brother of Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, was recently sentenced to life in prison by U.S. District Judge P. Kevin Castell, who described the case as one of state-sponsored drug trafficking. The Honduran president was consistently denied any role in drug trafficking, but nonetheless hired a Washington law firm to lobby U.S. prosecutors to desist in their case. In power since 2014, Hernandez has been strongly criticized by Honduran social movements for his authoritarian rule and policies that have led to increased poverty, displacement, and marginalization of the country's poor and working class. Tomas Andino Mencia, a former Honduran lawmaker and a member of the Convergence Against Re-election movement, believes that Hernandez's rule has been one of the major forces pushing people to migrate. The cause of the exodus is not just because of the economic or social situation, like poverty and violence that we know exists, but also because of a political cause. That is a despair that exists in the population, a lack of hope that the country's conditions will improve. That's also why the population flees. They don't want a future in Honduras with a government of drug traffickers, Mencia told the Honduras Now podcast in a recent episode. Hernandez was reelected to office in 2017 in a vote that was largely condemned as fraudulent. the country is due to hold general elections in November that could see the National Party remain in power. Honduras held primary elections in March in a process that observers such as Mencia claimed was rife with irregularities, a situation that does not augur well for general elections. If an election fraud happens again at this moment, with the conditions brought about by the pandemic and in the conditions that two hurricanes have left us, this could mean a situation much worse than what we saw happen in 2017, and this could generate a humanitarian disaster at a national level, said Mencia. Yet the U.S. Department of State, frequently vocal about allegations of corruption and fraud in Latin America, has been conspicuously silent about President Juan Orlando Hernandez's alleged ties to drug trafficking and the evidence of election fraud in Honduras's primary election. If they were to talk about the corruption, drug trafficking, the fiction of their whole immigration and foreign policy in Central America would be obvious, said Lovato. You are not going to see Anthony Blinken or Ricardo Zuniga or any other State Department and U.S. government operatives saying anything about Hernandez. U.S. policy helped create Hernandez, beginning with the coup in Honduras that was sponsored by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Activists and advocates have strongly criticized Democratic politicians for refusing to acknowledge the role of Obama's policies and pinning the crisis at the border on Trump's policies alone in an effort to obtain political gain, only to later implement similar plans. I'm going to make a quick aside here, and I really want to point out this bipartisan war on immigration and immigrants. This has been long going, and you can really point to even just like the administrations of Bill Clinton, who I'm reading this book. It's All American Nativism. It's written by Daniel Denver, but he goes and talks about this history. And in it, there are speeches where Bill Clinton is talking about immigration that it sounds like it was written for Donald Trump. He uses the term illegal aliens. He talks about preventing the criminal wave of immigrants from, getting over the border. When you really dig into some of the economic, material reasons that immigration happens, there's this kind of push and pull relationship between business capitalists who need that source of cheap labor and the sort of like reactionary nativism that wants to keep those workers out of the United States, and even played a role in some more reactionary unions at that time that also bought into this anti-immigrant rhetoric. But this has been a long standing problem. And as it goes in, like, it's deeper than Trump, it's deeper than even Obama, Bush, and Clinton. The history they talk about, we go back to the 70s, where the US and the CIA were overthrowing Latin American governments left and right. And that has left a long-standing generational crisis at the hands of Latin America that many of these countries, think of like Chile, are still dealing with tons of like corruption and violence and poverty, the very conditions that cause people to migrate in the first place. And even countries that were doing somewhat well, thinking like Venezuela, will be crippled by US sanctions that pushes down conditions in those countries to be abominable and abhorrent. And again, further stimulates waves of immigrants from coming up to the border. Some politicians in America are more responsible and honest about this. I got to give props to Jamal Bowman, spoke on MSNBC about this and was brutally honest about the immigration debate and talked about the need for something like a 21st century Marshall Plan because that's essentially what we did. The World War II, the Marshall Plan in World War II was U.S. money being used to help rebuild and rejuvenate countries that were completely destroyed by World War II. We have done that level of destruction to Latin America, which requires a similar response. We need to, if you build those countries back up, then they will be self-sufficient and people will not need to migrate up north to the United States. But that is a very inconvenient truth, and one that also again, when we're playing this kind of look-see game with the capitalists who want the cheap labor, they don't want those countries to get better. They want them to stay in those conditions so that they have a pool of cheap migrant labor that one they can pay as little as possible, and also when those immigrants try to organize or unionize against those kind of conditions, there's one phone call away from ICE getting deported. So all of this stuff is intentional and it is set up to work just the way it does by both Republicans and Democrats. And I think that's important for y'all to understand. Two recommendations: Daniel Denver's All American Nativism. And I'd also recommend Juan Gonzalez's Harvest of Empire, which is a documentary that really goes into the history of Latin American coups and CIA destabilization. And I'm going to keep going, finish up this article. This week it came to light that Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas reportedly told ICE staff at a recent meeting that the department is considering restarting construction on some parts of the border wall in order to plug in what he describes as gaps, despite having previously committed to halting construction of Trump's border wall. Lovato, who recently published a memoir called Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas, called on the public to see the connection between the Central American exodus and U.S. foreign policies that have been enacted by politicians from both parties, saying, you can't just sweep everything under the rug of Donald Trump. Lovato also called on the public to stop dehumanizing migrants and asylum seekers, and decried the mainstream media's circulation of two-dimensional images of their suffering. You have no Central Americans in three dimensions. That's called dehumanization, and that's what you need to sustain the policies that exist. If you actually start naming Central Americans, then you're going to have to change the policy because those people would become human beings. Anyway, that's an article from Truth Out. If you want to read it on your own, that's Biden's policies won't address the roots of the migrant crisis. They'll fuel it.